Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another of our Call to Serve virtual events. I'm AJ Bauer, our Senior Regional Director of Development with the USNA Foundation. We're excited for our first hybrid event. So thank you, everybody who's participating virtually, but also thank you to our great President's Circle donors who are here in the room with us. A few quick housekeeping items. This discussion is being recorded, so we will post it to our website after the event. And for all of our live stream guests, please submit your questions for the Q&A portion of our discussion via the chat function. We will be monitoring those and feeding them to Admiral Harris at that time. And now I will do my very best to introduce Admiral Harry Harris, class of 1978. Admiral Harris was born in Japan and raised in Tennessee and Florida. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1978, where he was a varsity fencer. He served 40 years in the U.S. Navy, retiring on 1 June 2018. He joined the State Department 3 days later. And from May 2015 to May 2018, he commanded U.S. PACOM, and now known as U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Most recently, Admiral Harris served as the U.S. Ambassador to South Korea from July 2018 to January 2021. He's the first Asian American to hold a 4-star rank in the U.S. Navy and the first to head PACOM. Now, Admiral Harris.
Thanks, Ashley, for that. Nice introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it's nice to be with you, albeit virtually for most of the audience. And it's always nice to come back to our Naval Academy. I must admit that when John Rudder asked me to speak at this event, I was a bit surprised. My academic journey through Annapolis was sporty at best. On a 100-point scale, on a 100-point test, rather, it's possible to get a 1. I probably hold the record for the number of majors anyone has gone through before finally switching into one that would permit me to graduate. I have to thank my 15th company classmates for pulling me through the academic knothole. And finally, some people assume that because I was a 4-star, I must have been a striper here. Well, I'll tell folks that I was a 4-striper. I had 2 stripes on each sleeve. So despite my academic record, or perhaps because of it, I have a great appreciation for my days here. I hail from the great class of 78, as Ashley said, and I proudly held the title of the Old Goat, the longest-serving Academy graduate on active duty. My classmates, Admirals Mark Ferguson and Cecil Haney, preceded me as the Old Goat, and another 78er, Admiral Kurt Tidd, assumed Old Goat duties after I retired. So whatever else we might be known for, the class of 78 may hold the record for alumni endurance. So you all might want to get comfortable. And I'm aware that one of history's greatest speeches was given by President Lincoln, and it lasted just over 2 minutes. Julius Caesar gave what might have been the longest speech ever, and his best friends killed it. So I'll keep that in mind, so let's get to it. There's no better way for me to begin this year of the Tiger than to share with you my thoughts on the importance of the Indo-Pacific through the twin lenses of having commanded Pacific Command in my time in South Korea as your ambassador. I'll give you a tour de horizon about the region against the backdrop of the U.S.-South Korea alliance amid the great challenges posed by the People's Republic of China, or PRC. But I thought I'd begin by giving you the wave tops about 2 things that I've been thinking about lately. First off, it's hard to take the podium these days, rhetorically, actually, or virtually, given my career without at least mentioning Afghanistan. The President's decision to withdraw was, in my view, the right one. After all, he campaigned on it and was elected. However, the execution was deeply flawed. Either the intelligence community got it wrong regarding the speed with which the Taliban took over, which is an intelligence failure, or the intelligence community got it right, which is the failure of government. We must understand what happened so history doesn't repeat itself. I'll opine that even though the President inherited a deeply flawed Taliban deal from the former administration, he not only accepted it, he embraced it. Therefore, he owned it, including the aftermath of the decision to pull out. Bottom line, I've gone through 3 stages of grief so far. Shock at the speed that Afghanistan collapsed, anguish at the debacle of the pullout, and anger for those killed left behind. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit that I'm stuck on anger. Secondly, like Afghanistan, I'm often asked about Ukraine. So I'll spend a few minutes here about first acknowledging the human tragedy that's being perpetrated by Russia. As Garry Kasparov recently said, Russia is committing war crimes on an industrial scale. The butchery in Bucha and the atrocities in Mariupol shine a spotlight on this. Europe is experiencing a refugee crisis the likes of which haven't been seen since World War II. So why does Ukraine matter? Well, if you had a lump of clay and you were going to mold a country, what attributes would you want? I think you'd want that country to be democratic, to have a good economy, to be friends with the United States, and to be a global force for good. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one of those already, and it's called Ukraine. Consider that Ukraine sent forces to Afghanistan in support of NATO, even though it's not a part of NATO. Consider that Ukraine sent troops to Iraq, where they fought and died for coalition and American objectives. Consider that the United States, before the pandemic, conducted almost $4 billion in two-way trade in goods and services with Ukraine. And consider that Ukraine is a key global source of manganese, titanium, lithium, graphite, uranium, neon, and krypton. It's estimated that at least 90% of semiconductor-grade neon for the American semiconductor industry comes from Ukraine. And remember, in 1994, Kyiv voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons after the Cold War at the behest of the West. Ukraine is indeed a global force for good. So why did Russia invade Ukraine at all? Well, in two words, Vladimir Putin. Maya Angelou once said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Folks, time and again, Putin has shown us who he is, and shame on us if we fail to believe him. In my opinion, he seeks to rebuild the former Soviet Union, not under communism, but to its old borders. Us geopolitical geeks have a term for this. It's called revanchism. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, of course, Ukraine, and others are at risk. The Baltics, too, but now they're a part of NATO, so that's a different nut for Russia to crack. And why now? In my opinion, opportunism. Putin sees the West as weak. He sees our political divisions play out in Washington, and he's doing a happy dance. And he watched the debacle of our endgame in Afghanistan. But Putin miscalculated, and stunningly so. He underestimated Ukraine's resolve. He might not believe that Ukraine is independent, but the Ukrainians sure do, and they're willing to fight and die for their country. He underestimated the former comedian and everyman who became the president of Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky has risen to his office in truly Churchillian fashion. He underestimated the resolve of the international community to break Russia's economic backbone, and Russia may never recover. He underestimated America's resolve to come together to support Ukraine with our treasure, our influence, and our bipartisan political determination. And he underestimated NATO's and the EU's resolve, especially Germany's. On the other hand, Putin overestimated his own strategy, a fantasy of his own making, that Russia could blitzkrieg Ukraine in 15 days. He overestimated the strength of the Russian army. What we're seeing play out on the battlefields today are poorly trained troops led by some very bad generals without adequate enabling logistics and understanding of combined arms. It was German General Heinz Guderian himself, one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, who famously said that logistics is the ball and chain of armored warfare. And it appears to me that the Russian army can't distinguish combined arms from a rock and roll band. Numbers are uncertain at best, but I've seen reporting that in 42 days of hard fighting, Russia has lost as many as 15,000 troops, hundreds of tanks and armored fighting vehicles, and 7 general officers. This is not Hungary, 1956, or Czechoslovakia, 1968. This is Finland in 1939. I'd argue that Russia's actions strengthened and unified, not weakened and divided, NATO, the EU, and the UN, as well as brought together a divided Washington. The exact opposite of what Putin believed would happen. In other words, he failed spectacularly, notwithstanding a certain inevitability simply because of the mass of the Russian army. Again, Finland, this time 1940. But don't be like Putin and underestimate the resolve of the Ukrainian people and never bet against the United States. So what to do? Ladies and gentlemen, diplomacy and diplomats matter. I, for one, am glad Ambassador John Sullivan is at post in Moscow. We must keep diplomatic lines and communications open with Russia now more than ever. However, I'm dismayed that we don't yet have an ambassador confirmed for Ukraine. Diplomacy is hard work. Permission granted to work hard. This is juice worth the squeeze. George Shultz once said that he who walks in the middle of the road gets hit from both sides. I'm proud that the United States has chosen sides, and I'm proud to be with you this morning wearing the colors of an independent Ukraine, and you thought it was navy blue and gold. So far, the United States has provided or pledged to provide billions in aid, including key military hardware such as Stinger, anti-air, and Javelin anti-tank missiles. A good start for sure, but there's more juice in that orange. And we must continue to expose Putin's war crimes to global audiences, including audiences in Russia. Now, people ask me whether NATO or an American-led coalition of the willing should enforce a no-fly zone. A lot of my colleagues and friends, including former generals and admirals, believe that we should. After all, we know how to do this. 12 years of no-fly zones over Iraq and Operation Southern and Northern Watch, 2 years of a no-fly zone over Bosnia during the Balkans War, or over Libya in 2011, in which I had a small part. But I have a different view. A no-fly zone of itself won't protect non-combatants on the ground against enemy troops and armor. We saw that play out in the Balkans. A no-fly zone will put into the airspace over Ukraine American and NATO pilots in direct confrontation with Russian pilots. And I don't think we're at this point yet, emphasis on yet, of risking direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia, the very definition of World War III. I support instead an approach that enables Ukraine to establish and enforce its own no-fly zone. But this means we must provide Ukraine with mid-altitude missile systems such as Russian S-300s to kill jets at higher altitudes than low-altitude Stingers can reach. This means getting to yes on the MiG-29 deal so that Ukrainian pilots have advanced fighters in sufficient numbers to actually enforce a no-fly zone. Hard to believe that we haven't figured this one out yet. Permission granted to work hard. And this means upgunning Ukraine's anti-armor capacity. None of this is easy. But if we don't act with urgency, we'll find the outcomes more dire and the options more dangerous. Of course, Russia gets a vote. And if Putin votes with tactical nukes, chem bioweapons, attacks against NATO countries, cyber attacks on America's critical infrastructure, and so on, then all bets are off. Even Putin isn't this crazy, I hope. Okay, enough about Ukraine. Let me move on to the Indo-Pacific. First off, finally, in February, the Biden administration released its new Indo-Pacific strategy. This strategy's bold end state is nothing less than a free and open Indo-Pacific that's connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. Importantly, it recognizes that America's greatest asymmetric strength is our network of strategic partners and allies. Its key tenets, including modernizing our bilateral treaty alliances with Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, advancing our major defense partnership with India, and building the defense capacities in South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. In my opinion, this guidance underscores that when working with allies and partners, give and take is preferred to crash and burn. And the textbook case in point is almost a 69-year South Korean-American alliance. Forged during a devastating conflict, it has stood the test of time. It's mind-boggling to consider how much has changed in the world in general, Northeast Asia in particular, and the Korean Peninsula especially. Some changes have been for the better, such as Korea's miraculous growth into an economic and cultural powerhouse, a high-tech innovation nation, leading by example in the battle against COVID. America truly reached an awful milestone last February. 900,000 Americans dead of COVID. 900,000. That's far more than the combined American military killed in both world wars, Korea and Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Staggering, really. And we'll be over 1 million by the end of this month. South Korea's approach on COVID-19 has been lauded, and rightly so, as a global model. They have 1/6 the population of the U.S. and 1/60th the number of COVID deaths. They're doing something right. As South Korea has changed and developed over the years, so too has the alliance. A multidimensional partnership reinforced by shared values, shared concerns, and shared economic interests, and underpinned by the deepest of people-to-people ties. It's lasted generations and will continue to thrive for generations to come, as long as we together nurture it, remain committed to it, and resource it. Other changes have been for the worse. such as North Korea's unrelenting pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, and Pyongyang's unmitigated aggression towards the South. Folks, the U.S. stands firmly with South Korea and is firmly committed to this alliance. This is important because North Korea and the PRC will continuously test the resolve of the alliance and will seek ways to weaken our strong ties and sow doubts in order to divide us. Now, while we hope for diplomacy with North Korea to be successful, we must recognize that hope alone is not a course of action. The quest for dialogue with the North must never be made at the expense of the ability to respond to threats from the North. So far this year, the North has launched a dozen missiles of increasing complexity, including hypersonics and last month's ICBM test. This is no path toward peace on the peninsula. Dialogue and military readiness must go hand in hand. Idealism must be rooted in realism. We must not relax sanctions or reduce joint military exercises just to get North Korea to come to the negotiating table. This is the tried and true road to failure. If exercises and sanctions are reduced as an outcome of the negotiations, fine. That's why we have negotiations, but don't give them away beforehand. Now, regarding the so-called end of war declaration, we should ask ourselves what would change the day after such a declaration is signed. It's not a peace treaty. The armistice will still be extant. Our treaty obligations to defend South Korea will still be extant. And North Korea's missile, nuclear, and conventional capabilities will still be extant. Let's not be seduced by another piece of paper signed by Kim Jong-un. It's unfortunate that North Korea has not embraced the opportunity presented by 3 U.S. and 3 South Korean presidential summits. The U.S. continues to seek transform relations between Washington and Pyongyang, lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula, and the complete denuclearization of North Korea, all of which were agreed in Singapore in 2018 and would set the conditions for a brighter future for the North Korean people. Now, while I believe that Singapore was not a perfect agreement, it's a good starting point to pursue peace on the peninsula. I also believe that North Korea missed a great opportunity in Hanoi, and they likely won't get another chance like that. I believe Kim Jong-un wants 4 things. He wants sanctions relief, to keep his nukes, to split our alliance, and to dominate the peninsula. During last year's 8th Workers' Party Congress, KGU talked about strengthening North Korea's nuclear deterrent. Last year, the IAEA expressed concerns about the trajectory of North Korea's nuclear program, and last May, the U.S. intelligence community formally assessed that KGU views nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent against foreign intervention. That doesn't sound to me like he's willing to give them up anytime soon. And you can be assured that he's watching Ukraine closely. Now to the elephant in the room, and that's the PRC. I'm often asked whether South Korea is being forced to choose between its only security ally and its number one trading partner. This is a false narrative designed to sow doubt about the history and strength of our alliance. Korea made its choice in 1953. Moreover, when choosing between not upsetting Beijing and standing up for its own and alliance interests, it's worth considering the entirety of cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea. The U.S. is the second largest investor in South Korea after Japan. Most assume it's the PRC. Combined with Japan, we have 40% of foreign direct investment in Korea. The China market is attractive, but the latte story shows the downside of focusing too much on simple market access. The U.S. has partnered well with China on several important fronts, but Washington and Beijing fundamentally disagree on how to approach the current international order. The PRC does not keep its word, from its treaty with the British on Hong Kong to its human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and others, to its attempts at commercial espionage and its quest to first isolate then dominate Taiwan. As I testified when I was a PACOM commander, I believe Beijing seeks hegemony not only in East Asia, but greater Asia and beyond. The PRC wants to set the rules for the region, indeed the world, and that's why it's essential that free nations exercise vigilance. The U.S. has made it very clear that we reject foreign policy based on leverage and dominance and seek instead to base relationships on respect, equal footing, and fair exchange. The U.S. believes in partnership economics. We won't weaponize debt, striving instead to build environments that foster good, productive market economies. We encourage every country to work in its own interests to protect its own sovereignty. I also note that the Biden administration's fundamental understanding of the PRC is consistent with its predecessor. Consider that Secretary of State Blinken testified at his confirmation hearing that the previous administration's tough approach is right, that what's happening in Xinjiang is genocide, and that democracy is being trampled in Hong Kong. Secretary of Defense Austin testified that he's focused on the pacing threat posed by the PRC, and he promised strong support for Taiwan. Now, speaking of Taiwan, it's democratic, an economic and innovation powerhouse, and a global force for good. I've called for ending the 50-year U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity in favor of strategic clarity. The new Indo-Pacific strategy specifically supports an environment in which Taiwan's future is determined peacefully by its own people. My successor at Indo-Pacific Command testified before Congress last year that the PRC could invade Taiwan in 6 years. That's 2027. We ignore Admiral Davidson's warning at our peril. So this brings me to the issue of Ukraine and implications for Taiwan. Hard to say where Beijing will land, but Xi Jinping is no fool. He craves stability in the international order so that he has time to shape that order to his favor. Russia's invasion throws a giant monkey wrench into his plans. The very things he seeks to weaken, the West, the U.S., the UN, our alliances, Japan, South Korea, and Australia are coming together with Ukraine as a catalyst. While supportive of Russia, the PRC is far from all in on Russia. And lest we forget, and Xi Jinping will probably like us to forget, Xi Jinping himself and then Ukrainian President Yanukovych signed a bilateral treaty in 2013 whereby the PRC promised to provide Ukraine with a nuclear security guarantee whenever Ukraine faced a nuclear invasion or faced an invasion involving nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons. Sounds to me like what's happening on the ground in Ukraine today. As most of you have known for years, I've sharply criticized the PRC for its lack of adherence to international rules and norms, even those rules and norms that it has signed on to. So here's an opportunity to take the measure of the PRC and Xi Jinping and prove me wrong. Now to Japan. Since the end of World War II, the network of U.S. alliances and partnerships has been at the core of a stable Indo-Pacific. No country can shape the future of the region in isolation, and no vision for the region is complete without a robust network of sovereign countries cooperating to secure their collective interests. This is why trilateral cooperation between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan is so important. It's crucial for our three nations to work together to enhance our security cooperation and preserve the international rules-based order. Notwithstanding the current tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, and these are not insignificant, the reality is that no important security or economic issue in the region can be addressed without both South Korea's and Japan's active involvement. That's why I'm encouraged by the outcome of last February's trilateral foreign ministerial meeting in Hawaii, where the three leaders condemned the flurry of North Korean missile tests and acknowledged the need to deter further such activity. The South Korean foreign minister went further and said that ongoing disagreements between Seoul and Tokyo would not affect cooperation on North Korea. I'm optimistic about South Korea's new president-elect's outreach to Tokyo and vice versa. The stakes are too high to take any other course. So now, what about the Quad? Well, I'm a big fan and booster of the Quad. That's the informal grouping of like-minded democracies in the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India. I called for the resurgence of the Quad when I spoke at the inaugural Raisina Dialogue in New Delhi in 2016. Jake Sullivan calls it the foundation upon which to build a substantial U.S. policy in the region. I recently began calling for the establishment of a Quad Secretariat headquarters somewhere in the region to coordinate among Quad members on what issues to take on, and perhaps also to get at the issue of how new members can join. You know, in college football, the Big Ten has 14 teams, and the Big 12 has 10 teams. So there's nothing that says the Quad has to have only 4 teams. Now, let me be clear. The Quad is not NATO, nor will it ever be NATO. It's a grouping of like-minded democracies who share an outlook on the region's opportunities, challenges, and dangers, but it's not a defensive pact. Now, the new U.S., Australia, United Kingdom, or AUKUS arrangement is a defensive pact, and I, for one, am all for it. President Biden just yesterday, along with Australian Prime Minister Morrison and British Prime Minister Johnson, announced cooperation in hypersonic weapons development. And I can't wait to see a nuclear submarine under Australian colors underway in the Indo-Pacific. I don't believe that this will take decades, as some have said, and if the three countries put their hearts, minds, and resources to the task. After all, we put a man on the moon in 8 years and developed a COVID vaccine in 1 year. We can do this. Lastly, we finally have an ambassador nominated for South Korea, Philip Goldberg, and his confirmation hearing is tomorrow, 15 months after I departed post. I know he'll get through the hearing without a problem. After all, he's our current ambassador to Colombia, and before that, our ambassador to the Philippines, Bolivia, and Kosovo. But even so, you have to be confirmed by the Senate. I tell my friends in Seoul that they traded up with Ambassador Goldberg, but this is far too long for a treaty ally to go without an American ambassador. Think about this. South Korea, a key security ally, a critical economic partner, a global powerhouse, and we haven't had an ambassador there since January of 2021. In fact, our 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, of them, only Japan has a confirmed U.S. ambassador at post. In the Quad, we don't have an ambassador yet for Australia or India. And we haven't had an ambassador to ASEAN since the Obama administration. Well, I tell my friends that this is emblematic of the divided political landscape in America. Last November in New York City, I called it legislative malpractice. We can do better than this. In fact, we must. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've talked too long, so let me close with this observation. We alumni have more in common than just a school, a ring, and a uniform. What connects us across the generations is our shared service, our shared values, and our shared hopes. For almost 177 years, the Naval Academy has graduated leaders who have the potential and character to reach the highest levels of command, citizenship, business, and government. Today, America remains the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. We see that play out globally, and especially in Ukraine. Thankfully, our nation has always been blessed with strong women and men of exceptional courage and character, patriots who step forward to do whatever it takes to defend Lady Liberty whenever she's threatened. And Annapolis grads have answered that clarion call to defend our nation time and time again to this very day. Our grads serve with distinction, standing the watch in an unbroken chain from generation to generation. Our battles, our victories, indeed our very way of life, are owed not to great moments or important dates. They are owed to the actions and sacrifices of individual women and men willing to step into the breach for their country and for their cause of freedom. America is the country she is because of her heroes, past and present, people who put the nation's interest above self-interest, who put patriotism above profit, and who put love of country above love of self. Non Civis et Patriae is more than a slogan, it's who we are. We are at an inflection point in history, in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, and indeed the world. Now more than ever, America needs men and women who are willing to forego wearing a business suit, forego strolling down easy street, and forego living the good life, to wear instead the cloth of the nation, to sail on a sea fraught with peril, to live instead a life on the ragged edge of danger, to live lives that matter. So may God bless the men and women of our armed forces, may God bless this great Naval Academy, and may God bless America. Thank you very much. Now I'm ready to answer, or at least try to answer any questions that you all might have.
Sure. So, Admiral Harris, we have several questions from our online participants. So this question is from Jennifer Johnson, class of 97. If China attacks Taiwan, what do you think the U.S. response would be?
Yeah, Jennifer, that's a great question, and it's a question that I've asked a lot. In fact, I'm sure that the president is being asked that very question. I don't know, but I will tell you that our actions, America's actions regarding Taiwan, are governed by the law. It's not a treaty, it's the law, and that's the Taiwan Relations Act. It sets those requirements that the U.S. has to do with regard to Taiwan, and especially those requirements that the State Department and the Defense Department have to do. Defending Taiwan is not a requirement under the law, and we don't have a treaty with Taiwan. In fact, technically, we don't acknowledge Taiwan as a separate country. We have this one China policy. But I believe that it would behoove us, and I know that INDOPACOM has plans and has considered all of the possibilities that should the PRC attack Taiwan. I don't believe the PRC would do it in the near term. The PRC has a lot of problems within its own borders, not the least of which is a failing economy and COVID. So they have a lot on their plate. But I do believe, as I mentioned in my remarks, Xi Jinping is watching what happens in Ukraine closely. He's watching the U.S. reaction to that and the rest of the world's reaction to that, quite honestly. So I think that what we must do is maintain our own level of high readiness. Should the PRC decide to make a move on Taiwan, I think we need to ensure that Taiwan has the means to defend itself, and that means the whole panoply of equipment that could stem an invasion from its west, and so on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And this question is from Commander Cody Lute. Sir, how do you perceive China's appetite for kinetic and/or non-kinetic conflicts will change leading up to and after China's 20th Party Congress in the second half of 2022?
Yeah, so I think that Cody, within the year, you talked about the Second Party Congress in 2022. I think that we're not going to see any dramatic changes in China's capability or intent within this year. I think that there'll be some rhetoric that'll cause people to worry, but I think we're okay this year. I think what's important, though, is to consider what Admiral Davidson said last year when he said that the PRC could invade Taiwan in 6 years, right? So that puts it in 2027. When I was the Indo-PACOM commander, I used to say that the 2020s was the decade of danger, but I didn't put a time frame on it other than the 2020s. I didn't put a year date on it. I do think that the 2020s is the decade of danger, because if you look forward from that, in 2049 is the 100th anniversary of the modern Communist Party in China, the modern China. So I think that there's going to be every intent by Xi Jinping and the government and the PRC to have all of its issues wrapped up by then. And by all of those issues, I mean South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan, and all those issues. So we are moving into a time frame of danger. And I think we're going to see increasing rhetoric from the PRC, also increasing capability from the PRC. And we must be prepared for that, and we cannot wait too long to do that.
And this question is from Sunil Mandava. What is the true nature of India's relationship with the U.S. when it comes to military and security issues in the region?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time thinking about India in my last job in uniform, and I visited India each of the last 3 years I was in uniform. I mentioned I spoke at the Rasina Dialogue in 2016. We have a growing and ever closer relationship with India for all the right reasons. They're the world's largest democracy. We have shared interests with them, shared concerns regarding the PRC and everything that's happening on India's northern frontier. One of the first international meetings that President Biden had last year at the height of COVID was a virtual meeting, but he got the four members of the Quad, four leaders of the Quad countries together to have a meeting. And the first thing they did together was work on COVID vaccine distribution, which goes to show you that the Quad is not only about defense, it's about other things as well. We have a growing defense industrial relationship with India and selling India stuff that they need. But we have to also understand that India, in its history, has purchased over time an enormous amount of Russian equipment over time. So we can't reasonably expect India to go cold turkey on 70 or 80% of their military hardware because of Russia. So they are hesitant to overly criticize Russia over what's going on in Ukraine now, because they're acting in their own enlightened self-interest. So we have to continue to work with India. But we are far closer to India and geopolitically or theoretically than India is to Russia, for example.
Thank you. This next question is from Thomas Mayer. Are our plans for naval assets in the Asia Pacific adequate to keep pace and maintain open seas versus the buildup of the Chinese Navy?
No. No, it's not. We need to do more, in my opinion.
Easy question. And then this next question from Roland de Guzman. Do you have any perspectives about China's investment in infrastructure as an arm of their foreign policy? How should we address their remarkable work in the South Pacific and other strategic places, North Africa, et cetera?
Yeah, so I'm going to not try to read into that question, Roland. And when you say remarkable, I'm just going to take that as dictionary definition of remarkable as in a lot, amazing, and all that, but not put any connotation of good or bad to it. Because I think everything that the PRC is doing in South Asia and Africa is bad, remarkably bad, if you will. I think that you cannot differentiate between Communist Party foreign policy and any other kind of foreign policy. There is no other kind of foreign policy in the PRC. Everything emanates from the center. So unlike in the U.S., you know, we might have our foreign policy may not be always consistent with our commerce policy or our treasury policy or our defense policy. In the PRC, everything is internally consistent because it all emanates from the center.
Great. And then if we have any questions here in the room, please feel free to ask.
I'll look at you now.
And then we have another question from Sunil Mandava. Had NATO sent in unarmed soldiers to the major cities to be peacekeepers, would that have worked? Would Putin have attacked, in your perspective?
You know, I don't know. I don't know if sending unarmed soldiers as peacekeepers would have worked. I'm not sure what an unarmed soldier actually is. And I think that we would not send unarmed soldiers anywhere without some overwatch and means of self-protection. You know, we could debate it, I suppose, but it would simply be an academic debate because the reality is that NATO did not, and Russia did.
I think we have some questions here in the crowd.
Hi, sir. You didn't mention Singapore when you went through the list. Can you give us a few comments?
So I'm a big believer in Singapore. I used to talk about Singapore as a partner that acts like an ally. You know, they give us access for nuclear-powered warship visits. We have 2 staffs that are based in Singapore. Don't want to use the word base, but they're physically present in Singapore all the time. And so they are a great friend of the United States. They're in a hard place because of the PRC, and even with that, they allow our aircraft carriers and submarines to pull through their ships. You know, we were keeping LCSs there before LCSs became en vogue, so we don't, you know. So Singapore is a great friend. We didn't have an ambassador in Singapore for the 4 years of the previous administration, nor did we have one in ASEAN, you know, which is a grouping of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And we don't have one, to the previous question, we don't have one in India now. We have, Garcetti has been named, Mayor Garcetti has been named, but not confirmed. And so we finally have an ambassador in Singapore, just recently, which is wonderful news, long overdue. You know, I didn't mention Singapore because they're not a treaty ally, they're not in the Quad, but they are vitally important to the United States. And they sit astride one of the major choke points in the world there, Strait of Malacca. Though you can go around it, but shipping companies aren't going to want to spend that extra money to go around. Okay, we'll take Shmarm, then we'll take.
Do you think there are any lessons learned from the Ukraine as far as perhaps waiting too long to do something prior to the invasion? And would that something like that apply possibly to Taiwan?
Yeah.
Or does that create too many issues?
Yeah, I'm not the European expert. I know that a lot of things were considered, and in hindsight, could we have done more beforehand? Could we have signaled Putin stronger? I think we signaled Putin in clear, unequivocal language that we would not get involved. Okay, well, that's a signal. Maybe we were too abrupt in that. Maybe we should have left room for doubt. Perhaps the stuff that we say that Ukraine needs, that I said Ukraine needs, S-300s and all that. Perhaps we could have positioned them earlier and all that. But I do think also that there was a feeling in the government here and in the governments in Europe that Ukraine would not have stood. We for whatever reason, underestimated Ukrainian resolve, and we overestimated the ability of the National Army in Afghanistan to withstand the Taliban. So, I'm not an intelligence person, thankfully, I guess. But, we got both of them wrong, one way or the other. So there's work to be done in that regard. I do think now, though, since Russia is in there, they're committing the war crimes, they're committing the atrocities, that we need to figure out how to help Ukraine more than we are. And we're sending, $1.7 billion of goods, of military hardware has been either sent or promised to be sent to Ukraine. And we've sanctioned the hell out of the country and the oligarchs and stuff like that, but we haven't done it. They need S-300s. They need those MiG-29s. Who are we to say what they need? They're not our MiG-29s. So it's not patronizing Ukrainians. If they say they need them, let's give them to them. They figure out a way to get them to them. And there are ways to do it. So.
This question is from Joseph Medina. Based on your dual experiences, what are the whole of government approaches methods that we should use to offset PRC's Belt and Road Initiative?
Is that General Medina from 15th Company?
He will have to respond.
So, I think that there's a lot of things that we are doing and that we can do with regard to Belt and Road. And for those who don't know, the Belt and Road is the term that the PRC uses in its expansion across Asia, Europe, and Africa for trading. There's a land component, there's a sea component to it, there's an Arctic component, and all of that. I think that one of the things that we can do is to shed light on PRC behavior in countries in Africa, for example, and how the Belt and Road, at the end of the day, clearly benefits the PRC to the exclusion of the countries in which they're operating. So the truth is one. We could liberalize our own rule sets for trading, for economy, which would make it easier for our companies and our industries to operate more freely in parts of the world where it's hard for them to operate in now because of restrictions by the government, restrictions of the law and all of that. So there are a number of things that we can do in order to offset the effect of the Belt and Road. I think, though, to be truthful about it, I think around 150 countries in the world have signed on to some aspect of Belt and Road. So it's not the idea that trade is bad. Trade is good. I'm a free trader, but I think it's how the countries are left after the trading value is done is something to be considered and looked at.
That was general.
All right.
Sir, good morning. you have undoubtedly been, at least for those of us in uniform over the last decade, you've been a source of inspiration and leadership. And I'm curious, for those of us who will be facing many of these challenges that you've outlined, and certainly the midshipmen who are here today, who inspires you? Who motivates you as you continue to be involved in various leadership roles and on your speaking adventures? Who inspires you to continue to tackle these really challenging problems?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of great mentors over time. I started out flying P3s, and I worked for Admiral Jerry McKay, who I've talked about in virtually every change of command I've ever had, and the influence he had on me. So, that's one. So great mentors is one. Because how far back you want to go, but I had great teachers in high school. It was a crappy physical plant, but the teachers were fabulous. They made up for all the shortcomings of that plant. So, so I had all that. So I don't know. There are some leaders that you follow out of idle curiosity, and some you follow because you're actually inspired by them. So I've had the opportunity to follow some really great leaders, and I've also followed some that couldn't lead lemmings over a cliff, and I've tried to learn from them as well. So.
And then there's Bruni.
That's right. Yeah, well, I won't say it out loud. I am on her.
Okay, we have one more online question. This is from Mark Thonen. In your opinion, how important is China's efforts in gathering U.S. intellectual property and infiltrating higher education to the overall strategic landscape?
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, that's how they do it. You look at some of their modern aircraft, and they look a lot like our top-line aircraft. And China is not burdened by law, regulation, and policy, so they can shorten significantly the acquisition timeline. We're bound by the law and regulation and policy, and rightly so, but they're not, and so they can steal our intellectual property and then move out, and then perhaps that whole R&D part of the acquisition cycle is eliminated, and they can go right into building. So it's significant to them. Now, I will say that in 2022, because of our liberal and open education systems, the PRC has sent students to America for decades, and they've attended our best schools and universities, except the Naval family, of course, and they go back to the PRC. So now they are able to jumpstart their own intellectual systems in the PRC. So we can't always fall back on the old canard that they've stolen everything, because now they're a creation nation, an innovation nation on their own. And we have to be sensitive to that and to look out for that.
Any more questions here in the room? Yes. Thank you so much, Admiral Harris.
Thank you again, everybody. We absolutely love this presentation. Thank you, Admiral Harris, for sharing your personal perspective on our geopolitical relationships and world events. We greatly appreciate everyone's questions and participation in today's discussion here in the room as well as online. Please take a few minutes later this week. We'll be sending out a survey. These surveys are so important to how we build out our future events. And also, you will be getting a full slate of future events coming soon, so be on the lookout for those. Thank you all. Good day.